The check for $50,000 sat on Margaret's kitchen table like a loaded gun, and she knew that cashing it would mean pulling the trigger on her own heart. She stared at the elegant handwriting on the memo line that read "Final Payment," and felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg. For 3 months, she had been receiving these payments from Thomas Hartford III, the man who was supposed to marry her daughter Sarah in 2 days. Each check came with the same message: stay away from the wedding, stay away from Sarah, and never contact the Hartford family again. Margaret picked up the check with trembling fingers. $50,000. More money than she had seen in years, certainly more than her job as a night shift nurse at the county hospital would ever provide. Thomas knew exactly what he was doing when he chose that amount. It was enough to pay off her medical bills from the cancer treatment, enough to fix the roof that leaked every time it rained, enough to finally give her the security she had been desperately seeking since her husband died 5 years ago. But it was also the price of never seeing her daughter again. Outside her kitchen window, the October wind rattled the leaves of the old maple tree that she and Sarah had planted together when Sarah was 7 years old. Margaret remembered that day so clearly. Sarah's small hands covered in dirt, her excited chatter about how the tree would grow big and strong just like she would. They had watered it together every evening that first summer, Sarah insisting on holding the hose while Margaret guided her aim. Now the tree towered over the house, its branches reaching toward the sky like arms stretched in celebration or surrender. How could something so beautiful grow from such small beginnings? While something as profound as a mother's love could be reduced to a dollar amount on a piece of paper. How had it come to this? Margaret closed her eyes and remembered the day Sarah first brought Thomas home. She had been so proud, watching her daughter's face light up as she introduced the handsome young man with his perfect smile and expensive suit. Sarah had worked so hard to build her life after college, landing a job at a prestigious marketing firm in the city, moving into a beautiful apartment that Margaret could never afford to visit without feeling like an intruder in her own daughter's life. Thomas came from a world that Margaret had only seen in movies. Old money, they called it, the kind of wealth that stretched back generations, built on investments and inheritance and opportunities that people like Margaret never even knew existed. When Sarah announced their engagement 6 months ago, Margaret had felt a mixture of happiness and fear that she couldn't quite name. The fear became clearer when Thomas's mother, Eleanor Hartford, showed up at Margaret's door on a rainy Tuesday evening in March. She stood there in her designer coat and pearl necklace, looking at Margaret's modest home with the kind of polite disdain that cut deeper than any insult. "I think we need to have a conversation," Eleanor had said, stepping into Margaret's living room without being invited. "About your daughter's future." That conversation had been the beginning of the end. Eleanor spoke in the careful, measured tones of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. She explained that while Thomas cared for Sarah, their families came from very different worlds. The Hartford family had certain expectations, certain standards that needed to be maintained. A wedding was not just about two people in love, it was about joining two families, two legacies. "Your daughter is lovely," Eleanor had said, and Margaret could hear the unspoken, but hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "However, we feel that perhaps she would be happier with someone more suitable to her background." Margaret had wanted to throw the woman out of her house, but something in Eleanor's voice made her listen. There was steel underneath the silk, a promise of consequences that Margaret was only beginning to understand. The first check arrived a week later, $25,000, with a note explaining that this was just the beginning. If Margaret could convince Sarah to break off the engagement, there would be more, much more. But if she chose to interfere, if she tried to fight this, the Hartford family had ways of making life very difficult for people who didn't cooperate. Margaret had torn up that first check, thrown the pieces in the garbage, and called Sarah immediately. But when she tried to explain what had happened, Sarah's voice had gone cold. "Mom, you're being paranoid. Eleanor is lovely. She's been nothing but kind to me. Are you sure you understood her correctly?" And that's when Margaret realized the terrible truth. Thomas and his family had already begun working on Sarah, slowly and carefully turning her against her own mother. Suddenly, Sarah was too busy to visit. Their weekly phone calls became monthly, then stopped altogether. When Margaret tried to reach out, Sarah's responses were polite but distant, as if she were talking to a stranger. The second check arrived with photos. Pictures of Margaret leaving the hospital after her late shifts, looking exhausted and worn down. Pictures of her small house with its peeling paint and overgrown garden. Pictures that somehow made her entire life look shabby and insignificant. The message was clear. This is what your daughter is trying to escape from. And wasn't it true? Margaret looked around her kitchen with its faded linoleum and the refrigerator that hummed too loudly, and she felt ashamed. She had worked so hard to give Sarah opportunities, to send her to college, to support her dreams. But maybe Sarah deserved more than a mother who smelled like hospital disinfectant and worried about paying the electric bill. The third check came with wedding invitations. Not an invitation for Margaret, of course. These were examples of the invitations being sent to the Hartford family's friends and associates. Elegant, expensive cardstock with embossed lettering that announced the marriage of Sarah Elizabeth Thompson to Thomas William Hartford III. Margaret's name appeared nowhere on the invitation. According to the Hartford family, Sarah had sprung fully formed into the world, with no past and no mother to embarrass her new social circle. Margaret had cried that night, sitting at this same kitchen table, holding those beautiful invitations and realizing that her daughter was about to marry into a family that had erased her from existence. But what could she do? Sarah had made her choice. The Hartford family had made theirs. And Margaret was just a tired, middle-aged woman with too many bills and not enough fight left in her. Or so she thought. The final check, the one sitting in front of her now, came with a wedding program. Margaret's hands shook as she read it. The ceremony would take place at St. Augustine Cathedral, the oldest and most prestigious church in the city. Sarah would walk down the aisle alone, since the program listed her as having no immediate family. The reception would be held at the Hartford estate, where 300 of the city's most influential people would celebrate the union of two young people who were clearly meant for each other. As Margaret read those words, something inside her began to burn. Not anger exactly, but something fiercer and more focused. A recognition of injustice so profound that it demanded action. Who were these people to decide that she wasn't good enough to be her own daughter's mother? Who were they to erase 26 years of love and sacrifice and bedtime stories and scraped knees and homework help and proud moments at graduations and all the thousand small ways that a mother shows up for her child? Margaret stood up from the table, leaving the check where it lay. She walked to her bedroom and opened the closet, pushing aside the scrubs and casual clothes until she found it. The dress she had bought for Sarah's engagement party, the one she never got to wear because she was suddenly uninvited at the last minute. It was navy blue with tiny silver threads that caught the light. Not expensive but elegant in its simplicity. She had felt beautiful in it when she tried it on at the store, imagining herself smiling proudly as people congratulated her on her daughter's happiness. As she held the dress up to the light, Margaret made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She was going to that wedding, not because she wanted to cause a scene or ruin Sarah's day, but because she was Sarah's mother and mothers show up. That's what they do. They show up when it matters, even when it's hard, even when they're not wanted, even when it might cost them everything. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, as if the universe itself approved of Margaret's decision. She dressed carefully, did her hair in the simple style that Sarah had always said made her look younger, and applied just enough makeup to hide the sleepless nights and worried days. In the mirror, she saw not the tired, defeated woman she had become over the past few months, but the mother who had raised a brilliant, beautiful daughter almost entirely on her own. She arrived at St. Augustine Cathedral 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The parking lot was full of luxury cars, and elegantly dressed people streamed toward the massive wooden doors. Margaret felt a moment of doubt as she watched these people who so clearly belonged to a world she had never been part of. But then she remembered something her own mother had told her years ago. "Honey, you belong anywhere your child is." The interior of the cathedral took Margaret's breath away. Soaring ceilings, stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns on the stone floors, flowers everywhere in shades of white and cream and the palest pink. It was more beautiful than any wedding she had ever seen, and for a moment, she felt genuinely happy that Sarah was having such a perfect day. Margaret chose a seat in the back, hoping to go unnoticed until the ceremony began. She watched as the Hartford family's friends filled the pews, their conversations a low hum of excitement and approval. These people knew how to attend weddings the way they knew how to attend galas and charity events and all the other social obligations that came with their privileged lives. And then she saw Eleanor Hartford, resplendent in pale gold silk, greeting guests near the front of the church. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the woman's satisfaction, the way she surveyed the scene like a general who had won an important battle. This was Eleanor's victory as much as it was Thomas's wedding. She had successfully eliminated the undesirable element from her son's life. The organ music began, and Margaret felt her heart start to race. In just a few minutes, Sarah would walk down this aisle, and Margaret would see her daughter for the first time in 4 months. Would Sarah even recognize her? Would she be angry? Would she demand that Margaret leave? But as the wedding march began and the congregation rose to their feet, Margaret realized that none of those questions mattered. She was here because love had brought her here, and love doesn't calculate odds or worry about consequences. Love just shows up. The doors at the back of the cathedral opened, and Sarah appeared. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her daughter looked like a princess from a fairy tale, her dress a cascade of ivory silk and French lace, her grandmother's pearls gleaming at her throat. Sarah had always been beautiful, but today she was luminous, transformed by happiness and anticipation into something almost otherworldly. But as Sarah began her solitary walk down the aisle, Margaret saw something that made her heart break all over again. Her daughter's smile was perfect, practiced, the kind of smile that belonged on magazine covers and social media posts. But her eyes, those eyes that Margaret had looked into every day for 26 years, were sad. Not devastated, not desperate, but quietly, deeply sad in the way that comes from accepting something you wish were different. Sarah was halfway down the aisle when she saw her mother. Their eyes met across the crowded cathedral, and Margaret watched as every emotion flickered across her daughter's face in the space of a heartbeat. Surprise, confusion, fear, and then something else. Something that looked like relief. Sarah faltered for just a moment, her perfect composure cracking like ice in spring. The congregation noticed the hesitation, heads turning to see what had caught the bride's attention. Margaret heard the sharp intake of breath from Eleanor Hartford, saw the flash of fury in the woman's eyes as she spotted the uninvited guest. But Margaret only had eyes for Sarah. Her daughter, her little girl, the baby she had rocked to sleep, and the toddler she had chased around playgrounds, and the teenager she had waited up for on Friday nights, and the young woman she had cheered for at college graduation. All of Sarah's life was there in that moment. All of their shared history and love, and the complicated bond that connects mothers and daughters, even when the world tries to pull them apart. Sarah reached the altar where Thomas waited, handsome and confident in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. Margaret watched as he took her daughter's hand, saw the way his family beamed with satisfaction. This was their moment of triumph, the successful completion of a campaign to remake Sarah in their own image. The ceremony began, and Margaret listened as the minister spoke about love and commitment and the joining of two lives. The words were beautiful, traditional, the same words that had been spoken at weddings for generations. But underneath the familiar phrases, Margaret heard what wasn't being said. There was no mention of family, no acknowledgement of the people who had shaped and loved these two young people before they found each other. It was as if Sarah and Thomas had materialized fully formed on this altar, with no past and no connections beyond each other. When the minister asked if anyone objected to this union, Margaret felt every eye in the cathedral turn toward her. The silence stretched out like a held breath, and she realized that everyone expected her to speak, to cause the dramatic scene that would vindicate Eleanor Hartford's decision to exclude her. But Margaret remained silent. This wasn't about her pride or her hurt feelings or her need to be acknowledged. This was about Sarah and what Sarah needed in this moment. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged. Rings were placed on fingers, and the minister pronounced Thomas and Sarah husband and wife. As the new couple kissed, the congregation erupted in applause and celebration. Margaret clapped too, tears streaming down her face, proud and heartbroken and strangely at peace all at the same time. As the wedding party began to process out of the cathedral, Sarah walked past her mother's pew. For just a moment, their eyes met again, and Sarah mouthed two words that Margaret felt all the way to her bones. "Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for showing up when it mattered, even when it was hard, even when you weren't wanted, even when it cost you everything." Margaret left the cathedral before the receiving line formed, before Eleanor Hartford could confront her, before the photographers could capture any awkward moments. She had done what she came to do. She had shown up for her daughter, and Sarah had seen her. That was enough. 3 weeks later, Margaret was working her usual night shift at the hospital when her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mom, it's me. I'm sorry. Can we talk?" Margaret stepped outside into the cool night air and called the number. Sarah answered on the first ring. "I've been thinking about the wedding," Sarah said without preamble. "About you being there. About how I felt when I saw you." "How did you feel?" Margaret asked, though she was afraid of the answer. "Like I could breathe again," Sarah said, and Margaret heard tears in her voice. "Like I remembered who I really was. I love Thomas, Mom. I really do. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that loving him didn't mean I had to stop loving you." They talked for 2 hours that night and every night for weeks after that. Slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild what the Hartford family had tried to destroy. It wasn't easy. There were hurt feelings to address, misunderstandings to clear up, and the ongoing challenge of Sarah's new life with a family that still didn't approve of Margaret's existence. But mothers and daughters are resilient creatures, and love has a way of finding a path through even the most difficult circumstances. Sarah began visiting again, first secretly, then openly despite Eleanor's disapproval. She brought Thomas with her sometimes, and Margaret was surprised to discover that he was genuinely kind, just young and too influenced by his mother's prejudices. 6 months after the wedding, Sarah called with news that made Margaret's heart sing. "Mom, I'm pregnant," she said. "And I want you to be part of this baby's life from the very beginning. I want you in the delivery room. I want you to be the grandmother you were meant to be." Eleanor Hartford had not been pleased with this development. Margaret learned later that there had been several tense conversations between Sarah and her mother-in-law, conversations that had finally forced Sarah to choose between pleasing her new family and honoring her relationship with her mother. To Margaret's profound relief and pride, Sarah had chosen love over social approval. The pregnancy had been difficult, and Margaret found herself back in her familiar role as caregiver and supporter. She drove Sarah to doctor's appointments when Thomas was traveling for business, helped her prepare the nursery, and was there to hold her hand during the worst moments of morning sickness. Eleanor Hartford maintained her disapproval, but she was no match for a determined mother and daughter who had rediscovered their bond. When Sarah's son was born, a perfect, healthy baby with his mother's eyes and his father's chin, Margaret was indeed in the delivery room. She was the first person besides the medical staff to hold her grandson, and as she looked down at his tiny, perfect face, she felt a completion that she hadn't experienced since her own children were born. Thomas, to his credit, began to understand what his family's machinations had almost cost them all. He saw the way his wife lit up when her mother was around, the way Margaret's experience and wisdom made her an invaluable source of support during those challenging early months of parenthood. He began to stand up to his own mother, insisting that Margaret be included in family gatherings and celebrations. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Eleanor Hartford never fully accepted Margaret, and there were still social situations where Margaret felt out of place and unwelcome. But love had found a way to triumph over prejudice and manipulation, and that was enough. Margaret thought about the check that still sat in her kitchen drawer, never cashed, a reminder of the choice she had made. $50,000 versus showing up for the people you love. In the end, it hadn't been a difficult decision at all. As she watched her grandson take his first steps in Sarah's living room, his chubby hands reaching toward both his mother and his grandmother with equal enthusiasm, Margaret realized that some things simply cannot be bought. The joy of being present for life's most important moments, the satisfaction of knowing that you chose love over convenience, the peace that comes from living according to your deepest values. These treasures are priceless precisely because they cannot be purchased. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. Sometimes love means showing up even when you're not invited, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the odds are stacked against you. Because the people who matter, the people who really know you, they need to see that you're still there, still fighting, still believing in the bonds that connect us all. How many times in your own life have you been tempted to walk away, to accept someone else's version of your worth? How many times have you let fear or embarrassment or the desire to avoid conflict keep you from showing up for the people you love? What would happen if you chose differently? What would happen if you decided that you belong anywhere your heart calls you to be? The truth is, we all have moments when we're offered payment to disappear from our own lives, to accept less than we deserve, to let other people decide our value. But sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to go quietly. Sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is just showing up, holding your head high, and reminding the world that you exist, you matter, and you're not going anywhere.